Hello, and welcome to HHH, the podcast where we talk about those horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and today we are going to be delving into one of the most notorious figures from Argentina's recent past, a dictator you've probably never heard of, General Jorge Rafael Videla. Now, Videla's rise to power and his brutal dictatorship left a scar on Argentina's nation that still echoes today. His military junta, I think is how you say it, was responsible for countless atrocities during the so-called quote-unquote dirty war, a period defined by systematic abduction, torture, and murder of thousands of citizens. Now, before we dive into the details of his story, I want to remind you, if you are enjoying this podcast, if you're liking these creepy stories about these horrible, awful people throughout history, please take some time to share this, like, subscribe, help others find this show, because I would love to bring you even more of these episodes and more deep dives into these horrible humans in history. So please continue to share this with all the people that you love and you know who like history or even just true crime, anything like that. So be sure you're sharing this. Thanks again for tuning in, guys. If you're new, welcome. I'm so excited to have you here. If you've been a listener throughout this whole thing, thank you so much for your support. I really appreciate it. Also, if you know of someone you would like me to talk about, please message me. I love getting suggestions, and I do have a couple suggestions waiting in the wings for you guys. So don't worry if you have sent me some suggestions. I have not forgotten to do it. I will be doing those. So if you have those, please send them my way. But let's jump into it. Today, let's talk about Jorge Rafael Videla. And this story isn't just about one man. It's about the horrific reality of what happens when power is unchecked and lives are sacrificed for political gain. So let's dive into it. Jorge Rafael Videla was born on August 2nd, 1925, in the city of Mercedes, Argentina. His upbringing was relatively ordinary for a man who would later become one of the country's most feared dictators. So he basically had a pretty normal life growing up. His father, Rafael Videla, was a respected military officer, and his mother, Lenora, came from a modest middle-class family. She was also very, very religious. His father was very strict with him. We've seen that before in the past, but his parents weren't abusive or anything. They were just, his father was a little more strict. His mother was a little more religious. But they lived a pretty normal life. As a young boy, Videla was taught the values of discipline and loyalty, two virtues that would become central, crucial to his worldviews as he climbed the ranks of the Argentinian military, which we will get into a little bit later. But Videla's family had strong military connections. Like I said, his father was a very respected military officer, and this heavily influenced him in his career path. He even attended military school at the age of 15 and quickly rose through the ranks due to his seriousness, intelligence, and ambitions. But he was quiet and reserved, so he didn't make a ton of friends, and so he was often alone at school. Not to mention, in his teen years, he started to really grow in his nationalism, and he had a deep admiration for the Argentinia's military traditions. And I also have to mention that he really admired the Nazis in Germany, like their philosophies, everything about them. He really admired them. And side note that I want to point out is during his teen years, many of the Nazis actually fled to Argentina because it was a safe haven for them, because a lot of people in Argentina really liked their ideas and their philosophies. Some people, some theorists believe that Hitler actually survived and it was a dummy that they found had committed suicide. It wasn't actually Hitler himself, and they believed that he survived and actually escaped and spent the rest of his days in Argentina. That's how much Argentina really welcomed in these Nazis. But the story about Hitler escaping is a story for another time. So back to Jorge. By the time he reached adulthood, Videla had set his sights very firmly on a career in the army, which surprisingly, his father actually strongly discouraged him from doing that. But eventually his father would just come to terms with, well, that's what my son's gonna do, so I guess I'm gonna support him. So it is kind of interesting, to me at least, that his father was kind of hesitant to support him in joining the military because it was so strong in their family, and maybe he was worried about the influence it would have on his son. You could see that he was very susceptible to the nationalism that was being caused by the military, but that's just a theory I have. I don't know, I could be very wrong. So, anyways, he completed his studies at the Argentinian Military Academy, and over the next decade, he quickly climbed through the ranks of the military. He was well liked by all of his peers and his superiors, specifically because he was so well disciplined and he had a very no-nonsense approach. Like, you couldn't mess around with him. He was all about the rules. He was all about following to the T everything. We will see a little bit later in this story that these qualities that everyone seemed to admire in him in the military would actually come to be part of what made him so ruthless as a leader. So keep an eye on that. The deeper problem was that at this time in his life, Videla held a personal belief that military intervention was the answer to literally all of Argentina's political instability. So at this point in time, Argentina was really trying to build up their democracy, like in the early 1960s. That's where we're at, as Argentina's political landscape became increasingly divided. It actually inspired Videla to have this worldview that only the military could step in and fix any of the issues that were being caused by the current political status of Argentina. So basically, the economy was failing, the democracy wasn't doing super well, and he thought, the only way to fix all of this is if we as the military step in and fix all of it. So the country was plagued by a mix of growing political radicalization, economic turmoil, and the desire for reform. So it was just kind of a power keg getting ready to explode. And for some like Videla, the idea of a stable authoritarian government seemed super duper appealing. So he was really drawn to that idea of really taking over with the military. And it wasn't long before we see the seeds of his military ideas of takeover really come to full bloom. So it really doesn't take long at all. So by the early 1970s, Argentina was in tremendous turmoil. There was political violence between left-wing militants and right-wing parliamentaries, and the government actually led to deaths of thousands of people. So all of these infighting between all the people in the different political groups led to the death of thousands of people. And the economy was really struggling. And like I said, the democratic government was seen as weak and ineffective. So the people were really, really wanting change and wanting something different. But I don't think they wanted his version of change and something different. But they didn't know that at the time. So this was the perfect storm for someone like Videla, a man who believed the military literally was the only solution to the country's problems. And it gave him the perfect justification for the actions he and his compatriots would soon initiate. So, on March 29th, 1976, the military junta, or military leadership, led by Videla, overthrew Isabel Perón, Argentina's sitting president. So, in March of 1976, he took all of his thoughts and feelings and put them into action, and had a lot of support from his other military leaders. And he would be the one leading the charge. Now, I do find it interesting that the political climate was what it was. Like, there's a lot of infighting and a lot of economic struggles and those kinds of things, because that's often when dictators are able to step in, because it's just a disaster in the country and people are just so desperate that they're like, whatever, we'll try this new person and see if it works. And that's when a dictator is able to step in. So it's kind of interesting because that's kind of the pattern throughout all of history. But I will say there are clues behind dictatorships before they come to power. And you can also see that pattern throughout history. So it's just really interesting if you study the dictators, like we're kind of doing. You can see these patterns. So anyways, back to the story. So he has taken over. They set up a coup, and that would mark the beginning of what is known as I don't speak Spanish, by the way, so if I butcher any of this, I apologize. The Guerra Sucia, or the Dirty War. We'll just call it the Dirty War from now on, because I can't speak Spanish. Anyways, the Junta claimed that they were rooting out all the left-wing terrorism, and so they took control of all of the government, with Videla as the supreme leader. He was at the helm of this new quote-unquote government, military-led government. He became the de facto leader of Argentina, assuming the title of Jefa de Gobierno, or head of government. That's all. That's what he was called, the head of the government. They were really creative when they came up with his name. But the true horror began when Videla and his military allies began to campaign. Well, they began a campaign of terror aimed at eliminating any perceived, notice the word, perceived opposition, real or imagined. So we've talked about quite a few dictators on this channel. They are always super paranoid. It holds true with this dictator as well. So they would go after any threat that they felt was real, even if it genuinely was not. So right after taking power, the Dirty War from 1976 to 1983 would begin. And this name is actually super ironic to me that it's called the Dirty War, because it's pretty fitting, because what they did was use super dirty tactics against anybody that they thought was their enemy. Like, they would just steal people in the night, and we're going to talk about all the terrible things that they did. But I just find it interesting that it's called the Dirty War. And it's like more ironic because they were the ones doing all the dirty stuff, like the dirty actions. Like, it wasn't because it was there was terrorists everywhere like they believed. They just used dirty tactics. So I find it very ironic. Anyways, this quote-unquote war was marked by extreme repression and violence. Videa's regime targeted anyone suspected of being associated with the leftist ideologies or perceived as a threat to the junta's power, which could literally mean anyone. Like, I find it so funny that all of these dictators can basically make the rules so they can kill anyone. Like, you just point to anyone. Yeah, I'm sure they're a follower of the ideals that I don't agree with. Kill them. Like, anybody could have been their enemy. It's just a pattern. I'm telling you, these patterns are crazy. So these individuals often included trade unionists, students, intellectuals, activists, journalists, and political dissenters. So again, are you noticing a pattern? Students, people thinking for themselves, like all of these kinds of things. Yeah, super interesting. Oh, and he targeted mothers and children, which we will talk about that in a second because that is fascinating. So under Videla, the Argentinian military embarked on a program of enforced disappearance, systematic torture, and murder. So first, let's talk about the enforced disappearances. What does that even mean? Well, let me tell you. So the government detained tens of thousands of individuals without arrest warrants, without a trial, or any form of due process. So they would literally just pick up people and throw them in jail. Victims were often picked up in the middle of the night, obviously, because you don't want the neighbors seeing what's going on because they might go in hiding. So they would pick these people up in the middle of the night. They would then torture them. And then the individuals would just disappear. And I'm sure you can guess what that meant. The exact number of people who disappeared is still disputed among historians, but the estimated range was from 10,000 to 30,000 individuals. To kind of put that into perspective, I work at a university that has 45,000 students. It's basically like the majority of those students that attend the university I work at just disappearing with no one knowing. I mean, except for the government, obviously. The government knew exactly where these people were and where they disappeared to, but that's a ton of people to just disappear with no one knowing where they went. These people were often taken to clandestine destination centers or detention centers, not destination centers. Sorry. Where they were tortured and executed. In many cases, the authorities would not inform their families of their whereabouts or deaths, leaving relatives with zero closure. Like, can you imagine that one day you go to visit, like, brother, sister, family member, whoever, you go over and they're just gone. And you're asking everyone, you're asking the police, you're asking everybody, do you know where this person is? Can you help me find this person? And you never get answers. But it turns out that the government just poofed them away. Like, that is so terrifying. That is horrifying. So I actually saw an interview of a woman in Argentina whose sons, she had two sons that were part of the people that disappeared. She said that they were taken in the night, and at first they were taken to jail, and they were allowed to call her every once in a while, and all they would say is, we're fine, don't come looking for us, we're fine. And then one day they just stopped calling, and she's like, that's when I knew that they were dead, because they no longer called anymore. I couldn't find out any more information. I could find out nothing about where they were. So she didn't actually know where they were. She had to actually wait for them to call her to be able to get any information from them. And then once the phone call stopped, she knew that they had been killed and was just shattered by the news. And at this point, she's in the interview, I think this interview that I saw was quite a few years old. But in that interview, she was an old woman and immediately started crying when she was talking about her sons. It was heartbreaking to watch. And I just can't imagine, like, just family members vanishing and not knowing what happened to them. Because a lot of families just never ever heard from them again, heard from their family members. She was lucky enough to get some phone calls. But, once they stopped, she knew that they were dead. So I mentioned that they would take them to these detention centers to be tortured. Let's talk about that torture for a little bit. So the people would be detained by the military and were often subject to brutal methods of physical and psychological torture. I think that's partially why they allowed those boys to call their mother, is because it was part of the psychological torture of like, yeah, no, you need to call and reassure your mom that you're totally fine. And then, mess with them in that way. That's what I think. But there was other ways of psychological torture that they used. So first, victims were often beaten. Obviously, that's always a favorite of these tyrants. They were also electrocuted. Often these electrodes were attached to, the special zones on people's body and then electrocuted. And the guards would sit around watching them twitch on the bed and cry out in agony and just laugh at them while they're being electrocuted from their special areas. Many of the inmates were raped and, they would also execute prisoners, but mock the executions. Like they would sit there and laugh at them in front of the other prisoners. In addition to that, they would do mock executions. So they would stand there and mock them, like the people that they're killing, in front of these other prisoners. And then they also had fake executions where they would line people up, pretend like they were going to kill them, and then not. See, psychological, like between the taunting and between the fake executions, like, so they messed with people's minds on top of the physical torture. And there was torture centers all over the country. They were known as Centros Clandestinos de Detención, I think. Detención. Ooh, I got it. Detención. Or CCDs. They were set up all over the country, including old military bases and abandoned buildings. So if you're picturing like they're using an abandoned building and in the basement they're torturing people, that's pretty accurate. That is a pretty accurate picture. One of the most infamous of these torture centers was the ESMA, Escluda de Macana de la Armada. I told you, I don't speak Spanish. I'm trying. Basically, the Navy training school in Buenos Aires. That's where the most infamous torture center was. And that's where a lot of their political prisoners would go. And they would execute a lot of people at that specific torture center. Now, the next thing I want to talk about that our friend Videla instructed his military leaders to do, so it disseminates down, was something that I was shocked I had never heard of before. And we all know that these dictators always find their own special way to mass murder, whether it's through gas chambers or firing squads or just starving or overworking the people. This, though, This was something that was totally unexpected and will blow your mind because it's not something you would ever think a dictator would do to mass kill people. I just was so confused by this and shocked I had never ever heard of it before. So Videla's favorite form of execution was one of the most horrific aspects of this dirty war that he committed against his people. So he would use a thing called death flights. Now I want you to use your imagination for a minute to think what that could possibly be, a death flight. And I'm guessing you're thinking of the right thing, but just in case, let me tell you what actually happened. So now that you've thought about it, let's explain. They would have military officers abduct the victims, in the middle of the night, no trial, no nothing. Just take all the people that they saw as potential enemies, whether or not they really were, it doesn't matter at this point. So they would abduct them. They would drug them just enough so they were out of it-ish, and then put them all in a plane, take off, fly the plane over the ocean, and then push them out of the airplanes while flying over the ocean. Hundreds of feet over the ocean, mind you, leaving them to die in the water. So basically, if the fall didn't kill you, your crushed body would be too damaged for you to not drown in the ocean. Yeah, so airplane deaths, being pushed out of an airplane, was not on my bingo card for dictators to kill mass amounts of people, but here we go. Videla gets a bonus star for creativity, I guess. Seriously, this one blew my mind because I was not expecting mass death by airplanes. But this gruesome practice was part of the regime's efforts to actually cover up their crimes by making the victims' bodies disappear without a trace. And if you think about it, it's a pretty clever tactic because you throw a body in the ocean, it's either going to A, get washed away, or B, be eaten by all the creatures in the ocean, or both A and B, or you literally will never see that body again unless somehow it gets trapped close by in rocks or something. But that was their brilliant way of being well, we want to mass dispose of people, but we don't want mass graves. All right, we'll just dump people into the ocean. So, yeah, so this tactic was used for many of the regime's specifically political opponents, including the quote-unquote disappeared, who had been taken to the clandestine detention centers. So a lot of people who had already been to the detention centers, who had been tortured. This was a preferred method for them to kill these individuals, was throwing them out of the plane. So when I heard when I heard that Videla had ordered these people to be killed en masse, I did not picture throwing people out of the planes as an option. I mean, I guess if he was trying to hide all those bodies, it really did work because they had a really hard time trying him later, which we'll talk about. But it's just crazy to me that, did they sit in a boardroom and say, what is the best way to dispose of our enemies? I know, let's just throw them out of a plane into the ocean. It's not funny because a lot of people died and this was horrific and a horrific way to kill people. I don't understand the decision making because all the other dictators just were like, well, just gas them or just let them starve or whatever. They just didn't care. But I feel like this had to be like thought through and planned. I mean, I guess in Nazi Germany, the gas chambers had to be really pretty thought through. They were pretty efficient. But I feel like there was a boardroom meeting about throwing people out of planes. I don't know. Anyways, I'm just thinking too much about this. It's just crazy to me. But don't worry, it gets worse. And you could be asking, oh, how could it possibly get worse? Oh, don't worry, it's because his regime specifically targeted pregnant women and children for the people to, quote unquote, disappear. Now, one of the most chilling aspects of Videa's rule was the systematic targeting of pregnant women. Women who were arrested, often for political activism or suspected connections to the leftist groups, so they didn't even have to be proven to be part of the leftist group or anything. They just had to be suspected. They would be arrested and were held in detention until they gave birth. And sometimes some of these women were arrested, and while they were in prison, they were raped and became pregnant, and they would stay in there until they gave birth. So once they gave birth, the babies were typically stolen from them. And then what they would do, so they would take the babies and they would illegally adopt them out to military families or families that had really strong ties to the regime, because they believed this would help them erase any traces of opposition to the military junta. Like, it is weird to me that that's how they went about doing this, is they were just like, no more babies. They will be sent to the families that we believe they would be sent to. I mean, I prefer that they did this than killed all these babies. I think it's better. But they kidnapped so many babies. And mothers would never see their children again. Like, this was insane to me. Like, I hadn't heard of any other dictator using this kind of tactic. But many of these children were never, ever reunited with their biological families. And to this day, there's a group called Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo who continue to search for these lost children. I feel like nowadays it might be a little easier with the genetic testing that can go on. And people can send that in and figure out their genetics and where they came from. But the fact that there's a whole organization still searching for missing children means that this was a massive group of children that went missing. I can't even imagine, I can't imagine how it would feel to have your child stolen from you and never getting to see them again because of some political paranoia that if those children aren't sent to the right families, they'll grow up to be thinking wrong or something. So, as often is the case for most of these dictators, Videla turned ordinary people against each other. We've heard this multiple times in many other stories where the dictator would turn neighbor against neighbor and just have everyone report on each other. This even happened in our Salem witch trials episode. Like, neighbor turned on neighbor and everyone's reporting everyone. Same thing happened in Argentina under Videla. So the military junta used state sponsors, specifically state-sponsored terror, to create a climate of fear. So anybody could be an enemy of the state. And that meant that they encouraged ordinary citizens to report any kind of suspicious activity, just like with Stalin, neighbor would report neighbor, friend would report friend, family would report family, because they were all so paranoid and didn't want to be the ones getting in trouble. The Wanta actually used a lot of propaganda in the media outlets to spread fear and hatred towards their quote-unquote enemies, or perceived enemies would be the more correct way to say that. So the propaganda promoted the idea that the military was saving the country from terrorism, but the reality was that the military's actions were designed to eliminate any political opposition, no matter how minor or how peaceful. If you spoke against them at all, you were considered a threat. And like I mentioned, Videla would use the media to spread propaganda. That also meant that there was strict censorship and control of the media. Videla's regime sought to control and manipulate the media to maintain its grip on power. So part of his enemies were journalists, writers, intellectuals, and they were very targeted for censorship or repression, because the government looked over major newspapers and TV stations, filling the airways with state-approved propaganda. They were not allowed to talk about any of the disappearing families or people. They could not talk about any of the deaths that were happening. Even if the deaths were journalists or anyone like that, anyone that spoke against the government would be killed. Independent journalists who dared report on the government's abuses towards the people were either silenced through intimidation or they were killed. They really didn't have an option. I actually watched a documentary about a British journalist who lived in Argentina. I forgot what his name was, but he lived in Argentina at the time, and he actually had quite a few journalist friends that were killed or that just disappeared because they were writing stories about what the government was trying to keep hidden. He himself had to actually flee with his family because someone threatened to kill his children. And his wife was like, okay, we can't do this, because he had his own paper that was printed in English that was talking about some of the missing people and asking questions that the government really didn't want him asking. So it was really interesting to see his perspective of things. And it was pretty dire. Like, it was pretty scary to be there at that time. Even if you weren't a journalist, if you were just a person who disagreed with what was going on, it was a pretty scary time to be in Argentina. And the media's portrayal of the Wanta as the defenders of the nation from left-wing extremism allowed Videla's regime to continue its terror campaign with some level of international support. So their propaganda not only convinced the people of Argentina that everything was okay, but internationally, people genuinely thought, oh, see, things are going fine down there. Everything's good. So the propaganda helped not only at home, but it helped internationally as well. Well, I mean, it helped at first. Anyways, it didn't continue to help because over time, as reports of the dirty war began to leak out with help from our reporter friends who escaped Argentina, specifically the one I was talking about a little earlier, he was able to escape and start talking about his experience and share what's actually happening in Argentina. So internationally, the condemnation started to grow, particularly from human rights organizations. They started to really take issue with what was going on down in Argentina. Now, Videla would justify everything that was happening by framing them as necessary to protect Argentina from subversion. The army systematically went after anyone they considered a threat. Activists, journalists, students, trade unionists, and anyone connected to left-wing politics. And like I said, it wasn't just political opponents who were targeted. It was entire families, Pregnant women were detained, their babies were taken, handed over to the military families that were loyal to the junta, and the atrocities were just widespread, systematic, and calculated. Like, it was a disaster. And Videla publicly defended all of these actions. He claimed that Argentina was at war with internal enemies who sought to destroy the nation. To Videla, these horrific crimes were simply a necessary evil in the name of national security. He sounds like a paranoid dictator to me. And if we have learned anything from all of my previous episodes about dictators, it's they are all freaking paranoid. So you can clearly see that that is what's happening here with Videla. So despite the brutal control the military junta had over Argentina, the country's people could only live under this state of terror for so long. In 1981, Videla's regime began to really falter. They started to lose control of the country, mostly because Argentina's economy was terrible. If they thought it was bad before, when Videla's regime took over, it got so much worse. Not to mention, the international community was becoming increasingly critical of the junta's human rights violations, so they were getting a lot of pressure from the outside world to stop what they were doing, and the people within Argentina were becoming increasingly frustrated because the economy was terrible. So in 1982, Argentina's disastrous invasion of Falkland Island, an attempt to reclaim these from British control, and they were a British-controlled territory right next to Argentina, it resulted in a humiliating defeat. Like, it was painful. So the military's failure to win the war was the final blow to Videla's credibility and power. So by 1983, Argentina had begun to transition back to democracy. The dictatorship was finally overthrown in 1983, and Videla was arrested. So in 1985, he was put on trial for human rights violations, but the trials were marred by the military's reluctance to fully reckon with its past. So no one actually wanted to admit that the military had been at fault for killing thousands of people. Not to mention all the missing babies and children. No one was willing to take any kind of responsibility for that. So despite the fact that everyone tried to dismiss that these things were actually happening, despite that, Videla was convicted for his role in the dirty war atrocities, and he was sentenced to life in prison. But don't worry, his story isn't quite over yet. In 1990, amid political changes again and growing pressure for amnesty for military leaders, Videla was released along with many of his co-conspirators. So he actually got out of prison. But don't worry, the amnesty was very short-lived because in 2005, in just a couple years, following renewed efforts to bring justice to the victims of the dirty war, Videla was arrested again and sentenced to additional years for his crimes. But then again, in 2010, he was convicted for his role in the deaths of 30,000 people, as well as other human rights abuses, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Jorge Rafael Videla died in prison on May 17th, 2013, at the age of 87. His death came after a long period of legal battles and public outrage over his involvement in one of the most brutal regimes in Latin American history. But while Videla's death marked the end of the physical presence in Argentina, his legacy would live on, both as a symbol of dictatorship atrocities and as a constant reminder of the cost of silence in the face of state sanctioned violence. So Jorge Rafael Videla's legacy is one of terror, suffering, and impunity. He basically got away with whatever he wanted and was only sentenced to jail in his later years. The dirty war may have ended, but its effects continue to haunt Argentina. The Madres de Plaza de Mayo, so the grandmas of Plaza de Mayo, who lost their children or grandchildren during this dictatorship, have still been at the forefront demanding justice for the victims. They're still, to this day, searching for these lost children. Videla's actions have sparked ongoing debates about the role of military in Argentina's political life and the importance of holding individuals accountable for human rights violations. While Argentina's government has made significant strides to bring justice to the victims of this dictatorship, many still argue that the full truth of what happened during this dictatorship has not yet been fully revealed. And they're hoping at some point all the truth will come out. And the years of impunity allowed many military officers to avoid trial for decades. And Videla's death did nothing to bring closure to all of these people. So his reign is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of military intervention in civilian politics and the horrific outcomes that can follow when authoritarian leaders exploit national security fears to justify violence. Argentina's struggle with Videla's legacy continues to this day. And as the country seeks to reconcile with its past and ensure that the horrors of the dirty war are never forgotten, because, if they are, we all know the saying, we're destined to relive history if we don't learn it, right? So they're trying to find the truth to make sure everyone knows what really happened, so it will never, ever happen again. So Jorge Rafael Videla's life and action serve as a chilling reminder to everyone of the dangers of unchecked power, and his rise to the top of Argentina's military junta and the terror that followed left an indelible mark on the country. And while he's gone, the legacy of his regime continues to affect countless lives in Argentina. And because of this and the fact that over 30,000 people died because of his regime and their war on their own people, Jorge Rafael Videla is our horrible human in history for the week. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let me know if you've ever heard of Jorge Rafael Videla. I might even be saying his name completely wrong, to be honest, but I apologize, not to him, but to you guys if I am saying it wrong. So I hope you enjoyed it. If you did like this episode, make sure you share with your friends. Make sure you're liking and subscribing, and I really appreciate you guys listening in. And be sure to listen next week as we talk about another cult. This time, the cult is located in Australia. The cult was led by a woman named Anne Hamilton Byron, I think is how you say her name. I might have been dyslexic and mistyped that, but she believed she was Jesus reincarnate. So this is going to be an interesting tale next week. And get this, the name of the cult is going to give you the heebie-jeebies. The name is The Family. How creepy is that? So join me next week as we talk about the evil things that the family and their leader, Anne Hamilton Byron, did. So we will see you next time on Horrible Humans in History. See you guys.